Thank you, folks, for joining us this afternoon. So this is part of the Center for Study of Slavery and Justice. This is America series, a conversations about racial slavery, its legacy, and anti-Black racism. Today, I'm very pleased that we will be in conversation, the third conversation in the month of April, with Black Monument Builders. This is an event sponsored by the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice and Africana Studies, Rights and Reasons. I am Renée Ater. I'm a provost visiting professor here in Africana Studies, and I will moderate the conversation today. We have 4 speakers, and I will introduce each of them, and then we will proceed with the presentations. Please enter all questions in the Q&A, and I will be attending them along with Catherine from CSSJ in order to make sure we get your questions answered. I also have questions of my own to facilitate the conversation as well. So our first speaker today is Vinnie Bagwell, an American sculptor. She is a representational figurative artist who uses traditional bas-relief techniques as visual narratives to expand her storytelling. She casts in bronze and bronze resin. She has won numerous public art commissions and awards around the United States. A Morgan State University alumni, Vinnie is an untutored artist and began sculpting in 1993. A native of Westchester County, Bagwell has most recently created the 7-foot bronze sculpture of abolitionist and suffragette Sojourner Truth at the Welcome Center over the Hudson Stake Historic Park in Poughkeepsie. She is also one of the finalists in Newark, New Jersey, where the city is commissioning a new statue to honor Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad in New Jersey. Our second speaker will be Manuelita Brown. She specializes in bronze, figurative, and portrait sculpture and has completed private, corporate, and public commissions, including a Matthew A. Henson statue on exhibit at the James E. Lewis Museum of Art in Baltimore, and Triton, an 8-foot rendering of the Messenger of the Sea on the University of California, San Diego campus, and the life-size statue of Sojourner Truth and a bust of Justice Thurgood Marshall on the campus of Thurgood Marshall College in San Diego. In Sojourner Truth, Brown demonstrates her preference for life-size as opposed to monumental sculptures of remarkable people to effectively help viewers relate to the humanity of the individual. Her primary goals are to contribute sculptural works to the American public which edify and give expression to the human spirit and to convey the strength, character, and beauty of her own people, the descendants of African survivors in the Americas. Becky Davis will be our third presenter, and Becky is a lecturer in the art or instructor in the art program here at Brown University. Becky Davis's creative practice explores the politics of representation, commemoration, and monuments, both structural and cultural. Her work questions how to engage with an archive whose sources and steward has historically been the dominant culture that oppressed and exploited her community. Working across disciplines, she collects still and moving images, documents, sound, and oral narratives. Using this collection of evidence combined with her own interpretation and response, Davis constructs what Pura Nora would call realms of memory, devices for remembering people, places, and events. These devices become monuments of duality, past and present, strength and oppression, obsoleteness and relevance, pride and anger, evidence and critique. Using these objects and collections of media, along with physically occupying space with her body, Davis creates a new history and personal geography. Ed Hamilton will be the fourth presenter. He is active in the Louisville, Kentucky community. He has taught workshops, held lectures at public schools, colleges, and conferences. He opens his studio for tours and is often called upon to judge art exhibits and has created opportunities for other artists to work and hone their craft and skills in his studio space. Hamilton taught sculpture at Jefferson Community College, is a member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, and a longtime member of St. George's Episcopal Church. He has served on various boards and panels for community arts organizations as well. He is a former member of the Mayor's Advisory Panel on Public Art and was previously appointed by the governor to the Kentucky Military Museum in Frankfort on Kentucky and serves on the executive board of the Thomas Clark Historical Center in Frankfort, Kentucky. So please join me in welcoming Vinnie Bagwell, and who will give her presentation this afternoon. Thank you.
So hi, this is America. All right, so for starters, I am a storyteller. And, you know, as an African American, I have to say that our stories, they have such weight to them that no books have the spine to carry them. And so, I strive to create eye-consuming destinations about the critical roles enslaved Africans played in African American history. And I create art for public places that conveys what I consider to be unvarnished truth. This is Frederick Douglass at Hofstra. And the goal is to bring the history of people of color to life. The centerpiece for Frederick Douglass is the maquette for that particular public art project. My style is defined by candid portraiture. This is Thumba the Boatman for the Enslaved Africans Rain Garden for Yonkers, New York, which will be coming this fall. And I use bas-relief techniques in a non-traditional way. And the idea is to elevate the culture of marginalized people. This legacy is in Memphis. And I'm untutored, so the gift has made me a creative steward of our nation's memory, because a lot of Black history is not documented. It's not in the curriculum. We have a few movies, but not nearly as many as the larger culture. And so my narratives are meant to expand storyteller to inform the viewer. This is the piano for the August Wilson play, The Piano Lesson, which was on Broadway and directed by Ruben Santiago Hudson. And the idea is to create visual intrigue. And my subjects have souls who speak to the viewer, and they're meant to be engaging. People send me photographs all the time of themselves with my sculpture, which I find really, really cool. In 2010, I created an initiative to celebrate enslaved Africans here in Yonkers, New York, where I live. A lot of people think of New York as sanctuary for enslaved Africans, and New York was financing and insuring the boats and doing all kinds of things. And so I created a public art commission to emphasize the importance of preserving local history. This is the Phillips Manor Hall in Yonkers. It's the oldest standing structure in Westchester County. And so I created 5 life-size sculptures. This is Isati. I named them. Again, the idea was to humanize enslaved Africans, to make people understand that these were people with lives and dreams and futures before they were stolen. And again, the idea is to humanize them. This is Bibi. Bibi is Swahili for grandmother. And so spoken word artist Ty Grael is the voice of the enslaved Africans Rain Garden. He is a spoken word artist from DC, and he has written 5 really amazing stories about the sculptures, trying again to humanize them and make people understand that these are people. You can find the stories on my YouTube channel. And so I also conducted in-studio workshops for students, grade 5 through 12, as well as college. And in these workshops, we just explored things like civility and tolerance. I lived in Columbia, Maryland, where civility is a curriculum from grades K through 12. And I wish that the whole country would institute it. If you look up online, Columbia, Maryland, civility, the curriculum will come up. It's quite worthwhile. And so the idea is to foster dialogue about racial equity and racial democracy. This is Sarah Lawrence College, which again is here in Yonkers. And civic engagement has become the keystone to my practice. This is my studio. I invite literally hundreds of people to come in, this is before pandemic, of course, to come in, see the work, and to talk about the meaning, and also to have critiques, like if you see something, say something. And so this is my idea of community building. And amazingly, as people began learning what we were doing, sponsorships and partnerships and in-kind services came, people offering to do things for free, which is helpful. And so this is the site plan for the enslaved Africans rain garden. It is a sanctuary. It's about an acre large. And the idea is that people can come here. It's right on the Hudson River. Over there where it says north, that is the river. And it's coming this year, finally, after 12 years of real arduous work. This is the site plan. Again, at some point, the city planner said it's too fancy. I'm like, there is nothing too fancy for the enslaved Africans. And so I'm very excited that it's about to be constructed starting probably in the end of May. And so my goal is to design truly memorable places where inspiration and innovation converge. This is, again, the site plan for the enslaved Africans rain garden. You can see kind of how I mean for people to experience them. And the goal is to create things in dramatic and exciting ways. This is night lighting for Victory, which will replace the J. Marion Sims sculpture on Fifth Avenue. This is my favorite part of this installation. The goal is to change the perception of place. And so in the process of researching at the very beginning of trying to figure out what to make for this public art project, I discovered that there are no Black angels in public art. If you find one, you let me know. It made me wonder, are you trying to say that Black people aren't in heaven? What do you mean? There are no Black angels in public art. Okay. Again, the idea is racial democracy replaces offensive public artworks. Of course, we've been talking about this in the public art arena for a number of years, but of course, last year, with the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the whole world began to realize that public art is a practical beginning for reparations for African Americans. And in this instance, the goal is to have the viewer discover what I consider to be an unfolding story of endurance. These are 12 women. They only know the names of 3. And these women were experimented on for years with no anesthesia, no painkiller. And although the rest of women in the world have benefited from J. Marion Sims' experiments, these women paid with their lives. And so the fun thing for me is that last year, my governor, his office called and asked me if I was willing to work during pandemic. And I'm like, yes, I am. And so are my people. And so I became an essential business. And so public art is a reflection of New York's values. That's what they told me. And that's what we practice here. The fun thing about my Sojourner Truth commission is aside from being designed to bounce the narrative, I discovered that her whole family is my friends on Facebook. I mean, they came out the woodwork wanting to talk and visit. This is her 6th generation grandson who came in like 6 days after the enlargement got into my studio. These are very talented people. Most of them are painters, and they embraced me, and now I'm friends with her whole family. The interesting tidbit about that family is that most people don't know that Malcolm X's family is married into Sojourner Truth's family. That's a whole talk show by itself. And so again, as is my practice, I have previews before casting, which invites the community into the process. And of course now, Sojourner Truth dignifies the walkway over the Hudson, which is the longest pedestrian bridge in Highland, New York. And this is on the Highland side, which is the Welcome Center, but the other side is Poughkeepsie. And so it's very interesting because African burial grounds are being discovered and recognized all over the place. There's a giant burial ground in the middle of Van Cortlandt Park that a lot of people don't know about yet. And of course, Newburgh is being challenged to reinter 99 enslaved Africans that they moved in 2008. So meanwhile, the 2nd largest African burial ground in New York State is in Montgomery, New York. Last summer, they called me and asked me to come up and showed me an amazing burial ground that is right near the road, 416, which is right off of 84. They have all these stakes in the ground. And of course, when I looked at it, I couldn't make any sense out of it. And of course, later I discovered that it wasn't every stake, which these were put in 1995, every stake was actually not a person. There were headers and footers, but I didn't find that out until I asked the United States Department of Agriculture to do a ground penetrating survey for me. The beauty of now is that we don't have to dig people up. We have modern technology to map. And so of course, we're getting ready to do a GIS and a GPR and again, GPS. And so the idea is to be able to discern exactly where are they, how are they, what are they doing without disturbing them. This is about preservation. These people are only about 18 inches below the surface of the ground. And so this is the site plan, just kind of shows you where they are. All the little dots are where they are. Up there in the top here, I have a little arrow. This is all swamp area. This right in here is a swamp, look like a gully. And so, the idea is to secure the swamp so that perhaps in the future, if archaeologists want to check it out, all they have to do is remove the boulders and they'll be in place as opposed to washed away. And then the other idea is to not have people walk all over them. In New York, we don't have woods like they do down south. The floors of our woods are really clean, basically moss covered with no undergrowth or, underbush or anything like that. So you can literally walk all through this if you want to. But if, hundreds and thousands of people start visiting this place, they're going to erode the land. And so that's not goals. So what I am suggesting, and we had a conversation with the town, was to create a pedestrian pathway that goes all the way around the perimeter. It's 8 feet wide, handicap parking, because right now it's just a truck turnaround. I mean, literally, if you get out of your truck and go take a pee, you're peeing in a burial ground. And so the idea is to dignify this place, to give these people back their humanity, and to enable people to experience the place. There aren't very many African burial grounds in, the country that have been handled well, let's just simply say. And so we're trying to set a standard for how African burial grounds are mitigated. Need to figure out just exactly where are the people and give them the respect. And by all means, celebrate them and allow people to learn about their lives. Irvington, New York in Westchester County, is recognizing their history of enslaved Africans. We're just getting ready to go to contract for me to design something for them. They know exactly where their people are buried, under a building, and they're not trying to remove the building. So they have, the grace to create a monument just to simply acknowledge them, which I think is noble. And so, hi, I'm a finalist for Harriet Tubman Newark. This is my presentation. I just submitted it yesterday. Finals were closed, and I'm very hopeful. One of the things that I really wanted to do was to remind people that, oh my God, typo, sorry. Harriet Tubman was only 29 when she became an escaped enslaved African and began becoming a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And so I made her young and beautiful, because a lot of us were much more beautiful when we were 29. At any rate, thank you. And I hope that's 15 minutes or less.
Thank you so much, Vinnie. That was perfect, actually. You were right on time.
Yay.
Yes, thank you. And I have so many questions for you. I'm really fascinated with the idea of the African burial ground and its retrieval, but I will save my comments for later because that's an important conversation. So Vinnie, if you can mute, we'll now go to Manuelita. If you can share your screen. And I'm going to go ahead and mute myself so you don't hear me unless you need something. Wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ater, for inviting me to participate in this important panel. And I'm honored to be in the company of such artists as Mr. Hamilton and Vinnie Bagwell and Becky Davis. Appreciate you all being here as well. Because I have been start out watching the news, and you get tired of watching the news. So we've been both tired and depressed sometimes. So we've been watching a series called Lost Treasures of Egypt. And I'm faced then with the importance and legacy of art making, whether it's for personal or functional or ornamental use. For today, what's in a private collection will be a significant artifact in centuries from now. The cast of things that were done in 460 to 450 BC were found in 1972. And the permanence of bronze appeals to me because I do want to communicate with people centuries from now. Sojourner, this is a maquette, was one of two sculptures that depict people in the time period that we're talking about. And in those period pieces, I'm still hoping to connect with universal emotions and intentions that people experience today. Sojourner was installed at UC San Diego in 2014, but funding for public sculptures is often a challenge. I started out attempting to fund her to fund the enlargement. I actually had done the maquette in an attempt to win a commission for Florence, Massachusetts. I was a runner-up, a finalist, but that's not the golden ring. So I decided some years later that I wanted to actually do her life size anyway, and I would use Kickstarter to fund it. But then a university professor saw my enlargement in the studio and worked to help get it installed at UC San Diego. In doing the research for the pieces, and I used text by Nell Irvin Painter as my research document, in addition to lots of other things I found online, was that she carried a Bible even though she couldn't read, but she had people read to her and to memorize the scriptures, because she was an itinerant preacher as well as a abolitionist and suffragist. You'll notice that there's a finger missing here, and that was an accident when she was on the farm the year before she was freed. And she freed herself because the owner said she hadn't been able to work fully, and therefore he wasn't going to release her as promised. So she just walked off, and things worked out so that she remained free. This is the carpet bag that I have her carrying. And I researched some designs from carpets of that era, because people used old carpets to make what they would use for luggage. And to demonstrate that she was on the move, I had the wind captured in her shawl and show the movement of her shawl, hat, and her skirt. The other thing is, like Vinnie mentioned about the sculpture she's doing of the 26-year-old, making her young instead of an older person. When Sojourner Truth changed her name from Isabella Baumfree and became Sojourner Truth, she was in her 30s and she was a vigorous woman. There was not, she was not walking with a cane at that point. And so I wanted this woman to be quite determined and active. So we have her positioned on a path that allows people to walk up to her and to show that she's actually in the movement and in the plane, where right beside her is a major thoroughfare for student walking. So she's part of that thing, that whole scene of people walking to their classes or from their dorm rooms. It's also helpful. One of the reasons that I like to do life size instead of monumental is to help people relate to the subject. And here is a boy, youngster, who actually seems quite engrossed in observing Sojourner. The other sculpture that I've done that represents this period is I'll Fly Away. This sculpture was actually designed or created as a commission for a family whose family had moved from Oklahoma to California. But as I worked on it, it was clear that this sculpture represented a lot of people in today's world. There are people who are fleeing conflict in many countries, in particular Syria, Somalia, Yemen, and lots of others. Then there are refugees that are fleeing violence and famine all over the world. In addition to that, we have those people who are trying to get into the United States, coming from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. And these are people who are looking for a space where they can be safe, they can raise a family, and they can grow old and not die of death from violence. Unfortunately, it looks like we may also be amidst a lot of people who are fleeing their homes looking because of the sea level rise. So there might be people who are, you could call them global refugees from having not taken care of the environment. This particular family, however, I wanted to make sure it was clear that they were a family that were caring for each other. Here you see the boy is peacefully sleeping while the father is holding him securely on his shoulders. So you can't sleep in that situation unless you're feeling safe and secure. So it was clear that the father is able to give the child that kind of security. The mother, on the other hand, is carrying what meager belongings they have in a quilt that she has sashed around her body like a backpack. But this quilt I made in the log cabin design because I learned that when a quilt is hung on a clothesline during the time when people were leaving the South for looking for safe havens, if the quilt center in the log cabin design was yellow or black, that meant you have reached a space that's a safe house. And she wants to make sure that when she reaches safety, she's able to offer that safety to someone else. I feel quite successful in work that I've done. If someone, for example, looks at Sojourner Truth and was to say, you don't want to get in her way. She's intent on where she's going and she knows what she's about. Or if you're looking at I'll Fly Away, and I'm pleased when a woman purchases, after seeing this in an exhibit in a museum, decides to purchase an edition of that one because it honors her family who fled with her from the Nazis in Germany. And so she has a personal identification with this seeking safety as a family. My art practice is indeed figurative, but also it's emotional. All the sculptures that I do in one way or another, I feel are monuments. They're monuments to the lives of Black people. They're monuments to the families, to the men, and to the women. Here you see 4 different pieces. While they're not public monuments, although this particular piece, But by Grace, is 5 feet tall. And she represents what I see happening so much now. This is a very new piece, that people who have lost their jobs and are looking for the assistance of others, they're either in food lines or they're in lines to get relief payments. Not all of them are on the street as this woman was when I saw her, but there's still people who are looking for their subsistence by getting people to help them along the way. This particular piece, these 2 here and here, the first one is Dreaming, and it represents to me what women all over the world do. They might stand at the end of the day to relax and think about all the possibilities for them and their family. And here in Just a Minute is a woman who's taking a rest from perhaps the cleaning chores or the caretaking chores for her child or for others' children, which has often been the case. And this last one is The Man. And I did that piece in response to the fear that men and others in this country seem to have of the bodies of Black men. And I did this piece and I decided if he has anything, if he has clothing on, then someone will fear he has something in his pocket. If he's carrying something, someone will fear that particular thing is a weapon. So how is he to be seen as just a man walking? And does that mean he has to be completely nude? And so that's why this man is walking with intention, but nude. I wish to thank you for this opportunity and to share with you.
Thank you, Manuelita. Really appreciate it. If you could stop sharing the screen.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I'll have you go mute, and then I will have Becky, you're up if you want to share the screen, and I will take myself off, and Becky, I'll let you go.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Ater. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Center for Slavery and Justice and the Africana Department's Rights and Reasons Theater for creating this space. Thank you, Dr. Ater, for facilitating. Thanks also to Manuelita, Vinnie, and Ed for sitting in conversation today. Thank you all for being here. I want to speak to you today with gratitude for the elders and ancestors of the Narragansett Nation, on whose land I am currently an uninvited guest, with gratitude for the elders and ancestors of the Muskogee Creek Nation, of the land on which I was born, and infinite gratitude to my own elders and ancestors, whose labor, joy, deeds, and sacrifices have made my life possible. I was born in Fort Benning, Georgia. It's an Army installation named after Henry L. Benning of the Confederate States Army. Pictured here is the Atlanta cyclorama. It's a 360-degree painting depicting the Battle of Atlanta from the Civil War. I first experienced this monumental artwork on a second grade field trip. It was the mid-1980s. The immersive nature of the experience of visiting this painting was heightened by the full-length diorama that extended the painting into the space of the theater. As an 8-year-old, I learned from that experience what it was like to be immersed in a story and culture that doesn't include you or want to include you. I also learned that places have power. So my practice is grounded in memory. It is also grounded by the charge that Toni Morrison states here, mentioned by scholar, writer, and curator, Dr. Anita Bateman. This history that I'm immersed in, if wielded properly, can be transformed into power. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge some artists who serve as a constant source of inspiration and creative kinship. Carrie Mae Weems and her use of the body to disrupt established narratives concerning place and belonging. Adrienne Piper and her annotation of the archive to offer a critique of historical events and their intersection with private narratives. And Jay Simple and the way he transforms historical objects, images, documents, and uses embellishment to create new stories. Growing up in Georgia, in rural areas, small towns, moderately sized cities, nostalgia and glorification of the old white South was normalized. In the summer of 2017, I took photos that would become a series of diptych photographs titled Documents into Monuments. This body of work was made in response to my thesis project, which was titled Whose Name Was Writ in Water. It was an experimental documentary about my fourth great-grandmother, Charity Ann, who was enslaved on a farm 40 minutes north of where I was born. She was a mother to 16 children, and those 16 children were fathered by her enslaver's son and namesake. So this body of work features a story that pairs landscapes of the town and landmarks of that county, along with documents that tell the story. Here's a detail. On the left is a monument's inscription that reads, "Fate denied them victory, but crowned them with glorious immortality." On the right is a bill of sale that lists the purchase of Charity Ann and 6 of her children by Isaiah Parker Jr. after his father's passing. 1 month after I took these photographs, the Unite the Right rally took place in Charlottesville, Virginia. So in its wake, I conceptualized In the Shadow of Dixie. In the Shadow of Dixie is an ongoing project that started as a series of interventions staged on Confederate monuments across Georgia, where I once called home. These structures are protected by a state law that was initiated in 2010. I couldn't have done this work without the support of master printers Jacques Bidon and Noah Lacarica and Gavino Puccioni, who served as documentarians. So each intervention featured a ritual. First was to document the site. So I did that through photography. You can see it demonstrated by the 4 images on the bottom left. Next, I set up a series of cameras to document myself during this performance. So you can see that represented on the top left in that still frame. Finally, I sat in the shadow of the monument while writing postcards to each politician with jurisdiction over the space, asking them to make a public statement on their position regarding the monument and to consider changing the law. You can see that represented on the right. On the bottom is a scan of one of the postcards that I wrote. On the top is an image of the actual postcards that I designed and had printed with the help of Jacques Bidon. So after this original series of actions, I realized that the story of how these monuments came to be was a powerful one. All but one of them, Louisville's slave market, had been funded and established by ladies' memorial associations. These groups of women charged themselves with memorializing the Confederacy. They were also responsible for shifting the narrative about why the war was fought in the first place. They used these monuments in advocating for textbooks and schools that looked favorably on the South. So in regards to this project, it wasn't only important to relate the history of the monuments themselves, but to also use them as a case study. The establishment of these structures and other Confederate commemoration practices has a direct correlation between spikes in white terrorism, Klan activity, and racial tension caused by the fight for civil rights, as demonstrated in this infographic produced by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So this understanding led to the multimedia installation of In the Shadow of Dixie that you see pictured here. It features documentation of the original interventions, but it also broadens the context of why the structures were built in the first place, and also why they have no space in public space. It includes a collection of evidence, antique postcards, archival document facsimiles, photographs, and scans of the postcards that I wrote to politicians, along with its interpretive text. So this is an image of the Louisville Market House that I mentioned. And the interpretive text that I wrote for this installation on the left. On the right, you see images or photographs that I took of the space. This is an antique postcard of the same site. And I found a number of these from over 100 years, from 1900 all the way up to present day. So this was the postcard that I designed for the intervention. It features a quote by James Baldwin from The Fire Next Time. Underneath the picture of the postcard is a still frame from the documentary video from the Louisville Market House. So as a footnote, 8 months into the original project, the Georgia State Legislature voted to strengthen the law that protected the monuments. But with an additional footnote, in the summer of 2020, through the sustained work of local activists and city level politicians, 2 of the 8 monuments were removed. One is slated to be dismantled soon. So a counter monument, FUBU, came on the heels of the previous project. In spending so much time on the monuments in Georgia, I realized the glaring absence of monuments meant to honor the lives and contributions of folks from my own community. Those whose labor, strength, and perseverance made our present moment possible. So I held space in the RISD Museum in Providence, Rhode Island, embroidering handmade textiles. I suggested, through this act, I suggested the metaphorical repair of the ancestral wounds of American history, ruptures that were incurred through the continued presence of Confederate monuments. So each performance started in the Grand Gallery, where I struggled to untangle a knot of Black thread. Then once the thread is organized, in the second part of the performance, I stitched these handmade napkins. The language on the napkins, or the narrative that's recorded on the napkins, talks about or documents the construction of the Confederate monuments that I held space on in the shadow of Dixie. And in the third part of the performance that was held in what was then a exhibition on design and repair futures, I talked about the performance at large, what it meant, what it symbolized, why I was doing it. So my labor was intended to construct living monuments commemorating the lives of enslaved and free Black Americans whose identities and contributions have gone largely unacknowledged. The table linens created during this performance reference the legacy and intimacy of inherited racism, as well as the domestic spaces for entertaining in which the monuments were largely organized and funded. This is a detail of one of the napkins from that performance. They were then used to create a multimedia installation that used a sideboard as a sculptural element. So in My Living Monument is an ongoing project that began by using a designated site of memory to start a conversation about monuments here in Providence, Rhode Island. Monument making is a practice which historically has been wielded by the wealthy, powerful, and privileged. Unfortunately, traditional historic narratives that often ignore significant contributions of women and people of color to society and culture. This project started in 2018, using the site of a public monument designed to honor General Ambrose Burnside to reintroduce the Rhode Island public to a few of his women contemporaries. The women of this project are Eleanor Eldridge, Ida Lewis, Katie Brownell, Sarah Harris Fairweather, Dr. Harriet Rice, and Charlotte Daly. So this project had 3 main goals: the revision and repair of this history, reclaiming public space, and democratizing the practice of monument building. Those goals were realized through first telling the stories of these women. And I did that through color-coded paving stones along the park, and also using sandwich boards with color-coded biographies detailing each of the women's stories. So we actually we literally used the platform of General Burnside to also tell these women's stories. We started by decorating the site. So the site was decorated with feather flags that were custom made, color coded and designed for each woman, and handmade pennant banners. Then I tried to really connect folks with these past narratives. So I did that through multi-sensory experience, creating candy in the style and flavors that would have been popular while these women were alive. There were soundscapes that told their stories, and scent jars that connected smells or scents that these women might have that were inspired by their daily lives. There were also research documents and used to create books. And then I prompted folks who were coming through the park, passing through the park, to leave the name of someone that they wanted to honor. And we used those to cover the base of the monument. In one iteration of this project, I invited several local artists to respond to the site and to these stories. Pictured here is Laura Lamb Brown Lavoy, a poet, an artist who created an unseparation station to address child separation at the border that was going on at the time. And this work is by Fumileo Aliru, who is an Afro-Indigenous artist, a member of the Narragansett Nation. And Fumi created these fluorescent messaging panels that surrounded and confronted the general. Janaea Kizzy, who is a local artist and archivist, created this monument to the invisible. So folks were invited to leave the name of something that needs to be seen that is not. And during a performance, she revealed the invisible messages on those cards. I want to thank you and for this opportunity, and I look forward to our conversation together.
Thank you very much, Becky. And already I'm really struck with the three of you that this idea of place is really interesting, like changing the perception of place and how we interact with it. It seems that both Vinnie, you, and Manuelita all mentioned that. So, Ed, if you are ready, what I will do, if you just unmute yourself, and I will pull up the PowerPoint, and I hope I have what you need here. I'm going to go ahead and go back and share the screen. And it will start with York, and then I have images of the African-American Civil War. Sound good? We need you to, let's see. Can you unmute, hit the unmute so we can hear you? There you go, Ed. Okay, here we go. Now and you just tell me, just say next slide, and I'll just move to the next slide.
Thank you so much and for this opportunity. And I must confess, I am totally in awe of all three of my wonderful participant artists here today. You just have such a wide variety and range of telling our history. And that's just, I'm just very in awe of that. But I'm a sculptor from Louisville, Kentucky, born in Cincinnati, but raised here in Louisville by two parents. One was a barber and one was a tailor. My mother was the barber and my father was a tailor. And so I grew up in the heart of the Black business district here in Louisville, Kentucky, matriculated through elementary school, junior high school, got to high school. My teacher said, "I think you've got something." And I didn't know what that meant. I thought she was going to tell my mother on me about something. But fortunately, she said, "I think you've got a talent and I want to help develop it." Graduated from high school, went to art school 4 years, graduated from there, started teaching ceramics and sculpture at a high school here in town, and then had the good fortune to meet the only sculptor who was actually making a living in Louisville, Kentucky at the time. And his name was Barney Bright. And so through meeting him and apprenticing with him, that's how I got started learning the trade of dealing with public art like he was doing his public art pieces. My first big public art piece was in 1984, for Hampton Institute at the time, a Booker T. Washington, a 9-foot heroic piece. Eventually, you start dealing with one piece, another piece begets another piece, and ultimately, over the years, these pieces develop. This particular piece is the York piece that sits down on the Louisville, what they call the Louisville Belvedere. It's on the water front down in Louisville. And it's actually where the Lewis and Clark expedition took off to the north, west to try to find a trail to the Pacific and back. I knew nothing about York. A gentleman by the name of James Holmberg, who was special collector, curator at our local historical society, the Filson's Historical Society, handed me a book. And the book was by an author by the name of Robert Betts, and it was called In Search of York. And so my mother was up in age, and I would take her to Winn-Dixie, and I would drive her, and she would go in that Winn-Dixie and stay for about a couple of hours while I would be out in the car reading this book about the history of who York was. There's no definitive pictures of York. And so I had to develop my own idea of how I would see this man. Who was York? And York was very instrumental in being a part of the Corps of Discovery. He was a slave of William Clark, who was the brother of George Rogers Clark, who was the person who was the discovery of Louisville, Kentucky. And so as York was with these 30 some men and women, there was only one woman, and that was Sacagawea. She was with the group as well. And so what they found out was that going through the Native American territories, somehow they had never seen a Black man before. And so ultimately, Meriwether Lewis and Clark put York up front. And as they would go through the villages, the Native Americans were fascinated with this man because of his Blackness. And they'd never seen a Black man before. And so one of the Native American chiefs literally walked up to York and spit on his arm and tried to rub the Blackness off of him. Well, it wouldn't come off. And so they called him Big Medicine. And so he became very much a part of the Native American people going up through the northwestern portions of the country. And so what I created was a large 8-foot figurative piece. The original maquette that I made, he had a hat on. But what I found out was if he was out there with this huge hat on, you wouldn't be able to see his face full because of the shadow of the sun and all of that. And so I literally just took his hat off, cut his sleeves off his shirt because he had a whole shirt on. And what I wanted to portray was the strength of this Black man who was very much a part of the Corps of Discovery. And with him holding his rifle, the 54 muzzle loader, you see some ducks that we sculpted that he would have hunted and brought back to the camp. He's got his bone-handled knife on one side of his waist. He's got his tomahawk to help cut things down. And also his powder horn is tucked up underneath his right arm there. And so as you see him standing on this monolithic stone, and there's on the bottom of the stone, you see the top of the stone, that's where I put his Army canteen and his pack, one of his packs that he would have put stuff in. And his floppy hat is in the front of the canteen there. So it's like he walked up on this bluff, threw down this stuff, and looked out to the land that he had gone for 3 years, a freed man for 3 years. And yet, what did he get from this expedition? Everybody got accommodations when they came back. Everybody got to go to the White House because this was an expedition that Jefferson started. He was the one that wanted to do this, check out the Louisiana Purchase areas. And so he got Meriwether Lewis, and Meriwether Lewis got William Clark as his co-captain. And that's how they put this group of people together. And so York was the only Black person within this group. When he got back, all he wanted was his freedom, and to no avail, Clark would not give it to him. We don't know where York is buried. We know that Clark said he was probably died of cholera in Tennessee. There's no definitiveness about that. But the story that I like to tell is that an old Black man was on a Crow reservation up in that Northern Territory much years later, and said he was on the Lewis and Clark expedition. So could York have gone back after he decided, I've been a slave all my life, I've been free for 3 years, why should I come back and be a slave again? So we like to think that he made his way up back to the territories and lived out his life with the Native Americans who actually had more respect for him than the people here where he was born and raised. So we move on to, we have the Spirit of Freedom. This piece, I was very honored to be able to compete for this commission, and Washington, D.C., and every sculptor wants to put something in D.C. because that's the city of monuments. And so what this was about, I found an article in the Jet magazine back in 1992, and it stated that they were looking to create a memorial for all of the 285,000 colored soldiers that fought for the Union. Now, who knew we had that many colored soldiers fighting for the Union during the Civil War, as well as 70-some-odd thousand colored sailors. And so it became a national competition, and it got down to 3 of us, then it got down to 2 of us, and then ultimately I brought my piece to the table and won the competition. And what I created was a semicircular tabloid with 3 Civil War soldiers on the front side and the sailor going toward the back side. Interestingly enough, as you look at this piece, it tends to kind of give you an idea of maybe, was this a flag shape unfurling? And when I was presenting the Marquette in DC to the Fine Arts Commission, the late J. Carter Brown, who was the head of that commission, as I was turning the piece and explaining it, and the committee was viewing it, he said, well, Mr. Hamilton, the only thing that I would recommend, I would like to see you put a flagstaff on the backside where the sailor is back there. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, it started out as a conceptual flag shape, but then as it developed, I did not see it as a flag shape anymore. I saw it as this ethereal, this wind carrying these men. And on the back, there's a backside to this piece too. I think we may have a slide of that as well. As you can see, there it is. Now, what I did on the backside, in the beginning, when I created this piece, I wasn't actually thinking about the backside. But when you talk to committees, when people give you ideas and things and you hear things, I had already kind of conceptualized the front. But I was at one of the committee meetings, and a pastor of a church in Washington, D.C. was on that committee. And he said, wouldn't it be interesting if whoever gets this commission would be able to include family? Now, how many war memorials have you seen with an actual family on it? And so when I got back to Louisville, I sat at my desk at the studio and I kind of started drawing something on the backside and a little figure here and a little figure there. Well, ultimately what it turned out to be a very intergenerational family. A soldier, his wife, two young little kiddos down at the bottom there, and then a grandfather and a grandmother. Could have been his grandmother, could have been her grandmother, grandfather. You see, he could have been returning from the war, or he may be going. It's up for your interpretation. And so you get this tabloid with the soldiers on the front being carrying the family along with them. Because what are we fighting the war for? That's what we were fighting the war for, family and freedom. And so I was very honored to be able to create this piece. Have we any more slides of that? Yeah, oh, stop, go back to that, next one.
Sorry.
One. Oh, it's okay. You see the face at the top?
Here we
Oh,
go.
right there, stop right there.
Okay.
That is the piece where the title of the piece comes from, The Spirit of Freedom. It was only while working on the actual clay version in my studio and sitting out in the studio looking at it up on the platform. You know, artists like to fill up space. And so I looked up there and I didn't see anything above between the young soldier on one side and the elder soldier on the other. And it just looked like a very empty, moving space. And I thought, you know, I need to put something up there. And so I had a little image of a face that I've had around the studio, and I pushed it up into the clay. And I thought, uh-oh, this is it. Because I knew I needed to justify why did I put that up there? Because these guys would pray at night. They don't know if they're coming back from their encampment or going into battle. So they would pray. And so I looked for a spiritual image that I could put up there that would carry them into where they were on their way to. And so once I put that up there, I had to justify why I put that up there, because you can't put anything in DC when you go before the Commission on Fine Arts and come back with something else. So you have to justify it. So how I justified it was, I called my pastor and I said, Pastor, I need to justify what this represents. And so we went to the Bible and I found the specific psalm that I thought was appropriate to why that piece worked within the context of this work. The 91st Psalm, for he shall cover thee with his feathers, and under thy wings shall thy trust. And that just hit me powerfully. And so I put that down in writing, sent that back to DC, and they had no problem with that. And so that was why the title of this piece was called The Spirit of Freedom. Now you see the detail works. These are life-size figures, and I wanted them life-size. And the Massachusetts volunteer reenactors held me to a fine-tooth comb. So you had to have everything appropriately of what these guys carried. The badge, the eagle crest on the cartridge pack, the rifle is all accurate, the buttons, everything had to be accurate. And so that's the role of a sculptor, is to create something, if you're doing something historical, you have to do it correct. And so that is the spirit of freedom. Let's see, Dr. Ater, what else do we have in your slide thing? So I'm a public sculptor. I've done.
So that's it. Those are the images that I had in there. Were just.
Oh, that's right. Okay, that's fine.
And we should probably, if you want to wrap up and then move to questions, would be great. So if you want to wrap up, yeah.
Okay.
Ed.
So I appreciate being a part of this. What I wanted to say was, after the Spirit of Freedom came, I've done 2 Abraham Lincolns, a 12-foot standing version at Center College, and one down on our waterfront here. And actually, I wish I had pictures of that, but there are 4 tabloid reliefs that go along with this 12-foot version of a sitting Lincoln. And the biggest tabloid down there bas relief is the slave plaque, that he would have seen slaves being put on these boats and going up the Ohio River or down the Ohio River, being put into slavery. And that was one of the torments that they tried to capture the historical center, who was a part of the narrative, to put the narrative together so I could work along and create the pieces that would go along with the narrative that they created. So he starts with his youth, his Kentucky connection, the Civil War, the split between the states, and then ultimately you walk into this group of Africans being and chained together. And so that's where I'm at this point. And I appreciate being a part of this. And all you guys are just wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Oh, Ed, thank you so much for your comments. So I think now what we'll do is to come all together and in conversation. And if you have any questions from the audience, please put them in the Q&A. I'm very happy to take questions. I did want to start. I mean, I had sent you some questions earlier when we first sent out the invites, but I do have a question that was really raised by Vinnie today, and that is about this idea that your work changing the perception of place. Like, I was really interested in that, Vinnie, when you said that out loud, because I see a connection actually to Manuelita's work in the public realm, as well as Becky, your interventions are trying to change space. I think Ed, your work around York is doing that. So could you talk about place a little bit? Because I found this interesting that it's across the board, perhaps an issue for all of you.
I'm going to talk about Victory first.
Okay.
Victory is a sculpture that is going to replace the J. Marion Sims on Fifth Avenue.
Okay.
Central Park. And so for decades, the sculpture of J. Marion Sims has been on Fifth Avenue. And this man is the father of gynecology. And he got that way by experimenting on Black women, oftentimes against their will, and not providing any anesthesia, no painkillers. And then going to Europe and using what he learned on white women and using painkillers and anesthesia. And so the communities of East Harlem and Harlem got together, and for 10 years, they petitioned the city of New York to remove this sculpture. It took them 10 years to get it down. They didn't want to explain to their children why this guy is here and who he is and what he's about. And so they were very excited to find a concept that they liked, except for that wasn't what the city selected. And so it created quite a bit of controversy. But again, the idea was to change the perception of place. Rather than celebrate a man who took an oath to do no harm, and there's a clause in the Hippocratic Oath that says you will not hurt women and children, and replace that sculpture that represents with something that represents the women who made his work possible. That's changing perception of place. That's the best one I've got when I talk about changing perception of place. Rather than highlight the oppressor, you highlight the victims and you make them the victors, because they're the one that made his life possible, made it possible for the rest of us women to be able to be treated, OBGYN, that spectrum they put with JJ to do the prep, that guy. He made it possible for all of us, but they did not celebrate the women, they were celebrating him. So this is what I call changing perception of place. It's the same thing with the burial ground up in Montgomery. It's a truck stop, seriously. Is a U-turn for 18-wheelers to be able to turn around and go the other way on a 2-lane road. It's like one way each way. Until you actually walk over to the little boulder that they put there, and it's the boulder about 3 feet high, it's got a little plaque on it, but when you walk over there, and why would you, unless you're trying to go to the bathroom or something, until you walk over there, you don't know what is in that woods. When you look around, you see all these stakes. There's a lot of them. And immediately you might think that maybe I don't know, Terminex or somebody was there. It's like, what are the stakes? And then you have to read the sign and it says colored cemetery. And so again, the idea is to humanize these people. These are young people, by the way. These aren't like old people. These are youth, talking about 20 years old and younger. They worked 86 people, kids basically, to death. How? Why? We're still trying to figure out the story, because, my intention is to include museum signage to be able to inform people of why these people are here, who brought them there, why, what happened, that is a story. Interestingly enough, that area is predominantly white. And of course, one of the first questions that was positioned to me was, yeah, but it's these people that live here are white. It's like, well, they need to know too. As a matter of fact, they need to know more than everybody else. One of the things that really struck me, and I'm going to stop, is when we had our elections last November, when they showed the map of New York State, I was like stunned by the number of red versus blue. And what we realized is that, here in New York, people think of New York as New York City. It's like, no, New York City is a very small part of New York State. Once you get past Westchester County, which is just above the Bronx, which is a borough of the city of New York, you're basically in horse farmland. I mean, it is beautiful and just picturesque up there, but the people up there do not have the same kind of exposure to diversity. And this is one of the things this country needs, talking about perception of place. People need to begin to understand and appreciate that, let's just say there is a God, he likes colors, okay? Everything's colors, 27,000 different shades of pink, birds come in all different colors, animals come in all different, flowers, people come in all different colors. The color of your skin has nothing to do with your person, it doesn't. That's the purpose of changing perception of place. And part of that is, again, trying to humanize. Let's just talk about enslaved Africans, because only a couple of years ago did we see Americans allow children to be separated from their parents and put in cages. These children, many of them are still separated from their families. That happened because, well, the government allowed them to be perceived as other. That's not acceptable.
Would someone else, I thank you so much, Vinnie. Would someone else actually like to respond to that? Because I think Vinnie's notion of place is interesting. Manuelita, I was really thinking about, like, what does it mean to have a Sojourner Truth statue in California, right? A place she did not go to. So what does it mean to have that kind of memory and to remind Californians, quite frankly, of this complicated legacy? So
it was interesting when the professor who came to view the sculpture in my studio as it was being enlarged, he was excited by it, but primarily because one of the colleges at UC San Diego has 6 colleges and is on its way toward 10, I think. But one of the colleges, Thurgood Marshall College, and one of the core curriculum for Thurgood Marshall College begins with the freshmen learning about the civil rights of people in the United States, learning about the Constitution, and one of the people that they talk about and have the students study is Sojourner Truth. So when he saw this, he said, we need her on our campus, because we need our students to really be able to see her not as a figure from the past that they're just reading about in a textbook, but as a person that they could relate to. And so he was the person, Dr. Mariscal was the person who set forward the concept to the university. And that's how it got from my studio to being completely realized. Because at my decision was, I'm going to get it to the point where I have it enlarged, and borrowed money from my husband actually to make a mold, so that I'd have a mold if I ever found a place for it. And this didn't have to go that direction. I was able to find a space for it at UC San Diego. Now, I would also like to see it on Rutgers campus, since some of the founders of the Rutgers University were the family that owned her family, that owned the Sojourner Truth family. So rather than have, what they have now at least is a plaque on a building named after that family. But what if they put the actual figure of Sojourner Truth in the courtyard of that building, or in the entry of that building, or at the front door of that building, so that people had to deal with why these people had so much money and what contributed to their wealth, that they were able to start a university. So my concept is to have people see themselves in connection with the persons that I represent in the sculpture, to see what they're experiencing today as having been experienced by those people many years ago. And to get that identification will help them understand what's going on in the world around them. When Vinnie said something about the children being separated and why there's been so much outrage, that's not new in our culture. And they were separating children when they were instituting what was called welfare. They were forcing the fathers out of the home in order to have some kind of assistance for the family, and then they'd end up taking children away. This has been something happening in the culture in this country for a very long time.
The other thing I want to say about Sojourner Truth also too is that a lot of people think of the women's suffrage movement as a white women's movement. And what they don't remember is that Black women were very much involved in women's suffrage. They were into women's suffrage. They went to suffrage for everybody.
Yes.
And they were running parallel routes. And Sojourner Truth was very much.
Vinnie, I think you froze.
Well, Vinnie knows that the sculpture that she's working on for the park in New York City, when they had their first vision of a monument celebrating the women in the suffrage movement, the very first proposal did not have Sojourner Truth in it. And that went back to the artist, and Sojourner Truth was added into that table of the other women who were involved, that we know as being involved in the suffragette movement.
So I'm hoping that Vinnie will come back, but can I ask another question, because you raised this, Manuelita, in your presentation, and I'd actually like, oh, it looks like we've now lost, it looks like people are losing folks here. Or there you are, Becky. So maybe Becky and Manuelita, one of the things I wanted to, and Ed, that came to mind was, Manuelita and Ed, your work is about permanence. It's in bronze. It's meant to have a very long history. And I was really struck, Manuelita, when you said, I want it to last several hundred years.
Yes.
This is really different from Becky, who's creating not transitory, but they are to a certain degree ephemeral. They're based in that immediate experience that a participant has in your work, Becky. So I wonder if the three of you could talk a little bit about like permanence as opposed to, Becky, what you're doing. And you have to unmute yourself, Becky, I think.
Yes.
Can I say something?
Sure, yes, no, please, Ed.
As we work in our studios and we create these pieces out of clay, and I've always thought, gee, I wish I could keep that clay, but I know I can't, because I know outside it wouldn't hold up.
Yeah.
Okay. Permanence is so important in a public setting. I don't care what you put out there, somebody's going to do something to it. Somebody's going to run into it. Somebody's going to take something and bang on it. And so it has to have permanence. And so I've always thought, what do I lose when I go from clay to bronze? And I think what happens is I think we create with our soulness with clay, because it's so much a part. And the clay I'm speaking about is not only the oil-based clay that we use, but we also, I use a lot of water clay. And water clay comes from Mother Earth, you see, and it has a richness about it, and it has texture, and it breathes. And so I look at that piece, and then I got to call the foundry in and they got to come and make molds on it. And then it's got to go through the process of wax. Then the wax has to be put in a mold and it has to be burned out. And ultimately the bronze takes the place of where the wax was. So now I'm dealing with a metallic piece, metallic in that it's metal. And yet it can't be anything else. If it's going outside, it has to have that permanence. And so that's what we do. We have to have that permanence.
I love that idea of breath in clay, and that's so compelling to me. And it makes me think about, so I feel like it's important to have both pieces, the permanent, because it's important to see ourselves reflected in the landscapes around us, reflected in the built and constructed landscapes. But I also think that the ephemeral, the personal living connection that we have to monuments and public commemoration is important, because it keeps our connection to the object vital, like having this personal relationship and building memories through an action and a repeated ritual, reminds us of these stories. And also, the stories have the ability to evolve, just like our relationship to structures evolves over time. Like we may feel differently about something now than we did when it was built. So yeah, I think it's important to have both of these concepts or these approaches, the permanent and the ephemeral.
Vinnie, I see that you're back. This is really, thank you for returning. You know what, technology, this happened every Friday last semester, that it would just die halfway through class. So it's not unusual.
Yeah, I know. And the killer is like, I have power. It's like, what happened?
So I also, the last question really, because we're coming up to the end, and then that I wanted to ask about is this notion of monument versus public art. And I raised this because Vinnie sent me an email after I had emailed the group about this panel and what we were going to talk about, and my whole academic, I got monuments and memorials on the brain. And Vinnie said, well, hold up, I call it public art. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit, if you all, what you think of this difference between public art versus monument memorial. Also, what I do understand is the way that these art calls for these are often under the public art rubric, because it's a little easier to get funding for it under this public art idea. But if you could talk a little bit about that, and then we'll wrap up for the day. Wrap up the panel.
I'm going to say that what I learned early on, I developed the Enslaved Africans Rain Garden from zero. And I learned early on that a lot of funders do not fund monuments or memorials. When you use that word, they're like, and so I was like, okay, cool. So, it's a public artwork. And so in the 12 years that I've been creating public art, I never used the word monument. I mean, I just never used monument. I never used memorial. I just don't use it because it was a no-no for funders. And I just kind of struck it out of my vocabulary.
Very interesting, actually.
I've never had a problem. I never thought about it that way. Although I do know there's somewhat of a difference in public art for funding and this type of thing. But when I guess all the commission pieces that I've had, somebody comes and say, we want to commission you to do a commemorative monument or a memorial. So I guess I never really thought about it like that. And that's an interesting point you brought up, Vinnie. It really is. I just go along with who's paying, who's sending checks. Who's paying for this?
Who's paying for it?
How soon you want it? How long do I have? Where is it going?
Yeah.
So
I think that points to the
interesting
difference between Ed and Vinnie. Ed is responding to people who already have decided they want a memorial or a monument. Vinnie is talking about something that she has dreamed up and wants to do and find the funds for. And that's how it started with my Sojourner Truth too. I had decided, okay, so they didn't choose my Sojourner Truth. They chose another Sojourner Truth who was an old woman, and I see her as this 35-year-old vibrant woman, and I want to do her. And so 10 years after that competition was over, I just said, I'm going to do it, period. I won't have that many more years on this planet to get it done. And so that's how that got going. And then it found its place. And I've since then actually sold a second edition of it to a family who put it in their garden. And so it's interesting when you want to do something that you have conceived of, and then you're looking for something. So I appreciate what Vinnie has said about avoid the idea of monuments and memorials. Just sell your public art.
Public places, that's it.
Art in public places, yes, yes.
I really like that idea too. I think that I use, when I talk about my work, I use monuments a lot, or use the term monuments because it has like a specificity to like dealing with memory and recording this memory in a way that will last. But I also think that I have a very broad notion of what a monument can be. Like, I feel like some of my photograph, when I work with images, I'm making monuments, which is a lot different from, like a structural, sculptural element. But yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Like shifting the way we think about monuments to a broad sense.
As a wordsmith, I love the word monument, but this is one of the things about being Black. You always have to wonder, what will they say? What will they think? And so we assimilate in the name of just being able to participate, to be able to benefit, to be able to do the work that we came here to do. So it's interesting because I never really thought about it much, really, the last 12 years until she mentioned it. And I was just like, well, it really occurred to me. It's like, I never use those words. Other people use them about my work and I let them, but I never use those words because I have to be careful. Because if I'm not careful, I could box myself out and not be able to achieve what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
So that's actually a really excellent point, right? That these terms are good to a certain extent. They help us in some ways to categorize. And I think, Becky, the idea of this, I see monuments as can be a fairly elastic term. What can be included underneath that category? I consider memorials to be a little less so, because I see them as very much tied with commemorative ongoing activities and really tied to somehow to the dead, to the spirit. And so that is something different. But I'm Vinnie, I appreciate that email you sent, because I want to think a little bit harder on public art, because for me, sometimes public art oftentimes does not have that historical anchor. And that's often where I see the difference between what we might call a monument versus public art. Let's say something that really is put up as a decorative, like to decorate the bike trail through Indianapolis. So they got all these artists to put a bunch of art up there. So it's pleasurable. There's nothing wrong with that. Listen, I appreciate that hugely, to have public art. I think that is quite different from the work that the four of you are doing, right? This claiming of a past, or of a Black past that is not told in public space, right? These stories that we need to tell about Black history, that we need to tell the hard truth of slavery through public monuments, is really key here. And the other thing that I find interesting about, relatively speaking, is the intimacy of your work. Manuelita, the fact that your work is life scale. The fact that York, I was there with you, Ed, looking at York, and it's not so overpowering. He's there. He's a really prominent, but he's not, a 25-foot Abraham Lincoln, right? Like, that's not the scale that you're working. Or Vinnie, the idea that one could enter the rain garden and have a contemplative experience to think not only about slavery and its legacy, like what is the real legacy of that as well.
Engagement. It's about engagement, and that's become like a new buzzword, but
it is about civic engagement.
Monument in DC is one of the first things that I went to see when I moved to Maryland. The point of it is that again, for me, it's about keeping images of Black people human. And so, for instance, an 8-foot sculpture for me, I would only do an 8-foot sculpture if it's in a giant space where the scale needs to be larger in order for the piece to not get swallowed up. But, in a regular kind of room, so to speak, I like the idea of doing life-sized as well, because it's really important to me as a Black person that the work that I do, that people understand that Black people are people too.
Mm-hmm. And that's what the work does, right? That representation of the body does that. Well, I'm hopefully that you all will participate in further conversations I'm going to have this summer. I'm going to do a series of interviews, but we're out of time and I don't want to keep the media services too much long. I will say, because my phone has been blowing up with texts, that there has been, and I will just simply let you know that Derek Chauvin has been convicted on all 3 counts of the murder of George Floyd. And that is a huge thing to have happened this afternoon. So go tune in.
Verdict's already in.
It's in, which means they made a fairly fast decision. So I just put that out there. I know there's still some participants, but because my phone, and I'm sorry I have looked because it just keeps, I'm like, what is going on? Is there an emergency? It's in fact to announce that this verdict has been rendered. Vinnie Bagwell, Manuelita Brown, Becky Davis, Ed Hamilton, many thanks for showing up here today. I am going to continue this interview and conversations with all of you. And I feel privileged to talk to artists who are creating this really vibrant, vital art in our public spaces.
And may I say, I'm so proud to be the only male participant with these lovely, beautiful, strong Black women.
Oh, I'm so glad, Ed. I thought that you could handle it.
I feel so small.
No, well, there
Keep up
are
the good work. All of you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Renee.
So be well, and I will talk to all of you soon. And thank you very much. And very much thanks for the series to this Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and to Catherine Van Amberg for helping me get this organized and getting all the tech, and to the tech persons for their assistance as well. And someone just wrote in that they didn't have a Q&A, but Beverly Haviland just said, thank you for this conversation. So thanks for being present. And Ed, yeah, woman power here. It's really fantastic. Okay, I will talk to all of you soon.
Thank you, everyone.